Hi, I'm Renee McFarlane.
And I'm Sarah Muller. This is the second video in a series of 3 videos about education budgets in South African public schools. In the last video, we looked at the budget at the national level to see how much total money is available. In this video, we now examine how that budget gets divided between the 9 provinces of South Africa and what rules govern this division.
So how does the pot of money allocated by the Treasury get cut up? To understand this, we need to look at the governance system in South Africa. Outlined in the Constitution is a system of cooperative governance that distributes power between 3 levels of the state. There is the national level, which covers things like the police, the departments of basic and higher education, the army, the social welfare system, parliament and the presidency, parastatals such as PRASA and Eskom, amongst others. Then there are the provinces, who each are responsible for basic education, healthcare, and infrastructural maintenance at the provincial level. This money also covers provincial government and parliament. Most of provinces' funding comes from the National Revenue Fund. How much each province gets is calculated with the equitable share formula. Finally, there is the local government level in the form of the municipality. Municipalities must provide water and electricity delivery, road maintenance, and refuse removal. Municipalities get most of their revenue through the service fees in the form of rates and billing and traffic fines. They get very little money from the province or the national level. You'll notice that education appears both at the national level and the provincial level. This is because both national government and provincial government have roles and responsibilities in terms of providing education. The national level mainly plays an oversight role, while the provincial government takes responsibility for the day-to-day running of schools by, for instance, appointing teachers, providing funding for textbooks, and so forth. The monies that are allocated to the province from the National Revenue Fund can take on 2 forms. They are either conditional or unconditional. The conditional grants comes with strings attached. They can only be spent on certain things, but the vast majority comes through the provincial equitable share formula, which is unconditional, meaning provinces are free to decide how they spend it. This gets quite complicated. You might notice that the amount in this picture is far more than the education budget we mentioned in the previous video. This is because the equitable share formula is the pot of all the money allocated for all the areas the provinces are responsible for, not just education. So national earmarks a certain amount for education, but this amount gets put into a big pot with other monies for things like health. The total pot, both unconditional and conditional, is about 538 billion rand that goes to the provinces, or about 45% of the total national non-interest expenditure, which was about 1.24 trillion rand, if you recall from the previous video. So what's in the pot? Here we break down the unconditional component, which is by far the largest component of provinces' funding. We'll come across a few of the allocations that are conditional in a short while. Into the equitable share pot goes, firstly, education, which makes up about 48% of the total amount. Then health, which makes up 27%. A basic component, which is based on population head count. An institutional component, which is for the overhead of running a province. This is because running a province has basic fixed cost, whether your province is 1 million people or 10 million. A poverty component, which is calculated on the income of the people living in that province. And an economic output component based on the provincial GDP. The poverty component is the first point we're seeing redress spending. That is, that the budget is recognizing that providing resources depends on poverty factors. For example, if your province has far more poor people, then a higher percentage of your population are going to depend on your free public hospitals. compared to a province with a large proportion of wealthy people who might be able to access private health care. Also, poverty correlates with illness, so those same people might need the hospital more often. The economic output component recognizes that provinces with higher levels of economic activity need more of certain types of infrastructure. For example, their roads may require higher levels of maintenance due to higher haulage volumes, or their rail infrastructure requires greater capacity for larger volumes of shipping. This pot isn't then just split up into 9 equal components, or just split up based on the headcount for each province. The calculation gets quite complicated and depends on how many people, of what income level, of what age, etc. Perhaps the most important aspect of the equitable share calculation is that it's not prescriptive. So while the National Treasury uses various factors to calculate what would be an equitable share for each province, the whole amount comes as one lump sum. The Treasury can recommend how the province should spend it, and various policies do constrain what costs must be met. But National cannot tell provinces what to do with their equitable share amount. So if a province wants to spend a bit more on healthcare and less on education, they may do so. And this is enshrined in the Constitution. It's a system that was meant to protect against an all-powerful centralized state. The political mood in the mid-1990s leaned towards this because the apartheid state was so controlling and prescriptive. But of course, this distributed power requires every level of the system to have capacity to play its role. The system of cooperative governance and the non-prescriptive nature of the equitable share formula helps us to understand why there is such variation in governance and spending across provinces in South Africa. Without going too much into the history, some provinces have better functioning provincial legislatures and capacities, while others have historical legacies to deal with. In education, unsurprisingly, the provinces that have struggled to deliver are those that contain the former Bantustan homelands, the Eastern Cape, KwaZulu-Natal, and Limpopo. These provinces also struggle with the dismantling of the homeland systems of governance, the historical, deliberate underinvestment in infrastructure, dispersed rural populations, and concentrations of young people of school-going age. They have to work under extremely different circumstances than highly developed provinces, such as the Western Cape and Gauteng, which have a legacy of stable governance, infrastructure, greater population density, and higher numbers of older people who move to cities to work. So how does the 48% of the equitable share pot that gets allocated based on education realities get divided between the provinces? 2 figures are used to calculate how much of the pie each province gets. The population register from the census collected through Stats SA and the information obtained from school enrollment figures that are captured on the Education Management Information System, or EMIS, by each school. Capturing learner enrollment on EMIS is critical for schools to obtain their correct amount of budget allocation. As mentioned previously, only 3% of the equitable share formula could be considered equitable in the sense that it is progressive spending to reduce inequality. For the large part, most of the monies are calculated based on headcount, irrespective of who is being counted. This falls far more into the equal camp, where one person is treated the same, even if they are rich or poor, sick or healthy. We mentioned earlier that some provinces that have struggled to bring about high-quality teaching and learning in their schools tend to be those dealing with rural populations. The cost of providing schooling in rural areas is much higher, just like with the provinces where a flat amount was allocated for provincial overhead. There are fixed costs also in running a school, no matter how many children attend. Rural schools tend to have fewer learners because they are spaced far apart. That is, the ratio of schools to learners is lower in rural areas than in urban areas, where high population density means far more learners live within a reasonable distance of one large school. But the equitable share component for education does not consider this in its calculation. It assumes the costs are flat for every child. Look at some of these numbers. In 2016, the Eastern Cape had about 15.4% of all enrollments in the country. But these learners were enrolled in almost 23% of all schools. In Gauteng, by contrast, about the same number of learners were enrolled, but in about a third of the number of schools compared to the Eastern Cape. And KwaZulu-Natal had 37% more learners than Gauteng, but almost double the schools. On top of this, rural provinces need better scholar transport as learners live far from their schools. This is another cost that urbanized provinces don't have, where learners can rely on generic public transport or even live within walking distance of their schools. Another way in which the equitable share formula doesn't match reality is through the schooling quintile system. Let's give a very brief explanation of this system. Up until 2005, all schools could charge school fees, but in poor communities this became deeply problematic. Parents couldn't afford fees, and often children were prevented from coming to school if they hadn't paid. Schools felt they had to charge fees because they were being given the same flat amount whether they served wealthy communities or poor ones. In 2005, school fees for the poorest 40% of schools were abolished, and a new policy came into place that allocated a little more money to those schools to compensate them for the lost fees. Soon after, the number of schools prohibited from collecting fees was increased to 60%. This is how the quintile system was started, to identify the poorest schools. The policy that governs quintiles is called the National Norms and Standards for School Funding. The initial quintile system divided the schools into 5 equal groups in each province, ranging from poorest to richest, and allocated extra funds to the bottom 3 groups, that is, the poorest 60%. This quickly became a problem, as poverty is not equally distributed between all the provinces. So it's not fair that the poorest 60% of the schools in the Western Cape get the same amount of money as the poorest 60% of schools in the Eastern Cape, when the Eastern Cape has far more poor children than the Western Cape. The system was revised, and the division for quintiles is now decided at the national level. The table shown here is released every year and shows how the poverty distribution falls to the different provinces. We can see, for instance, that the Eastern Cape, Limpopo, and KwaZulu-Natal have high percentages of schools in quintiles 1, 2, and 3. These are the poorest schools that may not charge fees. By contrast, the Western Cape and Gauteng have the most quintile 5 schools, that is, richer schools, and the fewest quintile 1 schools. It's not easy to decide whether a school is rich or poor, and very tricky to get income data on every child. So the quintile allocation is based on the location of the school and the general socioeconomic profile of its immediate surroundings. This can also lead to problems where a school is located in a wealthy area but serves poor learners who can't afford fees. So there is a slight progressive spending between the richest and the poorest of schools using the quintile system. While schools allocated to quintile 1, 2, or 3 are not allowed to charge fees, they get slightly more money from the government per learner. They therefore cost provincial governments more than quintile 4 and 5 schools. We'll see soon exactly how much more. The main point at the provincial level, however, is that the equitable share formula doesn't take the quintiles into account. The two policies are not in sync with each other. A province gets a small poverty allowance and gets a fixed amount per learner enrolled in school, but the equitable share formula is not adjusted for how many learners are enrolled in which type of schools. Another aspect that the equitable share formula doesn't account for is infrastructural investment backlog. Under apartheid, there were 19 education departments, all with different mandates and different budgets. In addition to the 4 national departments for each of the 4 racial groups, there were independent education departments for the homelands. The House of Assembly, which served white students, was given far more money to spend than the others. Outside of the homelands, the Department of Education and Training, which was designated to serve black African learners, had the least money of all. As a result, schools that were built and maintained under the House of Assembly are in far better condition, with brick buildings, sports fields, administrative quarters, and proper fencing and infrastructure. Ex-DET schools that historically served black learners are often derelict and have prefab classrooms and poor facilities. Schools in the former homelands often lack basic utilities such as running water and toilets. The education component of the equitable share formula does not in any way account for these backlogs. The unconditional nature of the equitable share formula opens up other complexities. For example, there is nothing national government can do if a province chooses to reallocate the equitable share formula grant from one sector to another. A recent example is that the Western Cape is reducing its proportion of the equitable share formula to spend on schools and upping spending on health. Also, some provinces have far better capacity to motivate for conditional grants that are ring-fenced by Treasury for certain purposes. For example, the Accelerated Schools Infrastructure Development Initiative, or ASIDI, was put in place after Equal Education won a court battle to have the National Department of Basic Education held to account to fix substandard school infrastructure. The money was set aside to make sure it was spent on fixing schools, which gives the National Department more control over spending. But a province like Gauteng may be in a far better position to put together the data, research, and paperwork necessary to motivate for this conditional money. And the unconditional money they receive is fungible. That means if they manage to secure, for example, 10 million rand from a conditional grant to build new classrooms, then they can take 10 million rand out of their unconditional money, which they might have had to spend on classrooms anyway, and use it for something else, like roads or hospitals. This means that more functional provincial departments can use their capacity to increase their budget in ways that struggling provinces can't. Okay, so we've gotten a sense of how the money moves from the national to the provincial department. We've also gotten a sense of some of the problems with the system. But what does that money get spent on? By far the largest slice of the education budget gets spent on personnel, that is, salaries. And this is normal. In any institution or business, the largest line item is salaries. Approximately 80% of the funds are earmarked for salaries, although in some provinces the number is higher. The number of teachers allocated is calculated on a ratio. This ratio is about 1 to 38 in primary school and 1 to 34 in high school. High schools need more teachers to accommodate timetable subject selections and because high school teachers are specialists in their subjects. At primary school level, the same teacher teaches all the subjects, which makes timetabling far easier and allows for tighter teacher-to-student ratios. Although provinces sometimes allocate a few posts as poverty posts to put a couple of extra teachers in poorer schools, this is a negligible amount. For the most part, the ratio is calculated on headcount. That is, on the principle of equality. It's important to note that the quintile system doesn't affect staff deployment, also called post-provisioning, which means how many posts are provided to each school. The other 20% of funding, called non-personnel funding, falls under the national norms and standards for school funding and is based on the quintiles. So schools in quintile 1, quintile 2, and quintile 3 are given more of the non-personnel share than quintile 4 and 5. But this is only a fifth of the total budget. That is, 80% of the budget is equal and only 20% of the budget is equitable. At this point, we haven't even begun to address the idea of whether the amounts we're talking about are adequate. We've only looked at what is spent equally and what is spent equitably. What is equitable, of course, is not a fixed law, but depends on your idea of what you think is fair. In our next video, we'll have a look at how much spending is differentiated based on the quintiles. We're going to go back to the policy document again that is released every year, the National Norms and Standards for School Funding.